Hi, Neil, LeBron, you, and Socrates and Plato. We are going to talk about the Euthyphro now. I assigned it for not, as I think I said in the assignment, I assigned you to read it not for the particular issue that it's talking about, which is what is piety, but I assigned it so that you could see how Socrates behaves and how he interacts with people. What I'm looking at, what we're looking at is what I would call Socrates' fundamental essence, which is this idea of examination and self-examination. As I pointed out on page 41, where he says the unexamined life is not worth living for human beings. At least our interpretation of it. The key aspect there is what Socrates is saying is that our lives are worthwhile, are made worthwhile by our understanding of them, and our understanding does not just happen. We have to investigate. We have to examine. So the what I the theme that we're looking at is, and it's the theme of Socrates and what we're reading. The theme is examination. So we also see in the Apology that this idea of examination is what Socrates believes led to his unpopularity. He examined the politicians, the poets, and the craftsmen, and sort of examined them to see what they knew and what they thought they knew but didn't know, and then he showed them that they didn't know what they thought they knew. Not something that not something that is pleasant to experience, probably for someone in that sort of a situation. The one thing that Socrates says that wisdom is that he does claim, as his friend Chaerephon said, no one is wiser than Socrates. Socrates figures out that what his wisdom is knowing that he doesn't know, and that's what he is about. And so all of that comes to examination and self-examination. So we see that in, I think, a general way, and even really in a specific way, how it resulted in his predicament that he finds himself in the Apology. So I want to look at Socrates now as he appears in the Euthyphro, and what we get is a picture of Socrates examining someone. I mean, that's what he is doing. I must point out at the beginning, and I'll try to point it out throughout, that Socrates examining other people, it's not accidental. He has a method of examination, and that method entails him pointing out to people that their beliefs are inconsistent, meaning that they're inconsistent with other beliefs that they have. They're contradictory. And this is called, one way of thinking of this is that Socrates has what we would call a method of refutation. He is looking to refute people's claims. And we see that it's unpleasant. So what we're going to find in the Euthyphro is Socrates questioning this guy Euthyphro to see if his beliefs, Euthyphro's beliefs, are consistent or contradictory. And when they are contradictory, Socrates will point them out. Um, as I said before, it would be nice if you had the book that we're using, Five Dialogues, in which the Euthyphro is located. It would be nice if you had that in front of you. I think it's better if you follow along. You will get more out of it. It's just that it's kind of that simple. LeBron agrees with that also. You will get more out of it. Um, so so Socrates and Euthyphro get into this conversation where Socrates examines Euthyphro. they meet on the court steps, on the steps of the courthouse, where Euthyphro is about to enter and charge apparently his father, as he says, with a very serious crime, the punishment for which is death. Socrates tells Euthyphro, they exchange some greetings. Socrates tells Euthyphro that he is in fact also going into the courthouse to find out what the charges against him are. And so they get into this conversation. Socrates says to Euthyphro, "What brings you here?" Euthyphro says this, and then Euthyphro, when Euthyphro says that he's charging his father with the crime of impiety, this raises the theme of the dialogue, piety and impiety. We're not, as I've said, getting into the theme as such, but it's relevant for knowing what's going on. Euthyphro says he's going to charge his father with impiety. Socrates says on page 5, Euthyphro says on page 5, he says, "Both my father and my other relatives are angry that I am prosecuting my father for murder on behalf of a murderer when he hadn't even killed him," they say. "And even if he had, the dead man does not deserve a thought, since he was a killer. For," they say, "it is impious for a man to prosecute his father for murder." But their ideas of the divine attitude to piety and impiety are wrong. So Euthyphro says he's prosecuting his father for impiety. He kind of implies that he knows a lot about piety and impiety, and Socrates, in his response to what Euthyphro has just told them, underscores that. And Socrates says on page 5, following what I just read, Socrates says, "Whereas by Zeus, Euthyphro, you think that your knowledge of the divine and of piety and impiety is so accurate that when those things happened as you say, you have no fear of having acted impiously in bringing your father to trial." What Socrates is saying to Euthyphro here is, you're pretty confident that you know what piety and impiety are, because if you didn't, you wouldn't have charged your father with such a serious crime unless you were really confident about what you knew. And Euthyphro says, "I should be of no use, Socrates, and Euthyphro would not be superior to the majority of men if I did not have accurate knowledge of all such things." What Socrates has done here is he has set up Euthyphro for a fall. Euthyphro is clearly one of those people who thinks he knows things, and as Socrates will show in this dialogue, Euthyphro doesn't know those things that he thinks he knows. But it also is the case that Euthyphro is very full of himself. I mean, I've said he's confident, but he's arrogant. He's arrogant and conceited. And Socrates sort of intuits that and sets up Euthyphro for, essentially a great fall. I mean, imagine saying this. Kind of a thing to someone, as Euthyphro says, "I should be of no use, Socrates, and Euthyphro would not be superior to the majority of men if I did not have accurate knowledge of all such things." I mean, really, what an arrogant person would say that. He's talking about himself in the third person. Euthyphro would not have accurate knowledge of, and so on. It's kind of ridiculous, and Socrates continues to pump him up. I mean, what Socrates does is he sets a trap for people who are full of themselves, and when they fall into it, he nails them. And Euthyphro, so Socrates sort of carries on with this pumping Euthyphro up, and Socrates says, "It is indeed most important, my admirable Euthyphro, that I should become your pupil." And as regards this indictment against himself, he means, challenge Meletus, one of Socrates' accusers, about these very things, and say to him that in the past that I considered knowledge about the divine to be most important, and that now that he says that I am guilty of improvising and innovating about the gods, I have become your pupil. I would say to him, if Meletus, you agree that Euthyphro is wise in these matters, and so on. I won't read the whole thing. I probably shouldn't have read that. It gets pretty long. But the idea is that Socrates is setting Euthyphro up to fall into the trap of arrogance and of claiming to know things that he doesn't know. And then on page 6, Socrates asks the question that is the determining question of the Euthyphro, and that is, and that is, so Euthyphro has said that he more than anyone knows what piety and impiety are, and Socrates says, well, it's going to help me if you know this, because I'm going to be charged with impiety, so I'll become your student and learn from you so I can defend myself better. So on page 6, Socrates says, and I will read this paragraph. He says to Euthyphro, "It is because I realize this about you, Euthyphro, that you think you know a lot about piety and impiety. It is because I realize this that I am eager to become your pupil, my dear friend. I know that other people, as well as this Meletus," who's going to charge Socrates, "as well as this Meletus, do not even seem to notice you, whereas he sees me so sharply and clearly that he indicts me for ungodliness. So tell me now, by Zeus, what you just now maintained you clearly knew. What kind of thing do you say that godliness and ungodliness are, both as regards murder and other things? Or is the pious not the same and alike in every action, and the impious the opposite of all that is pious, and like itself? And everything that is to be impious presents us with one form or appearance, insofar as it is impious." And you would probably say, what Euthyphro says here to this incredibly complicated question, Euthyphro says, most certainly, Socrates, what this whole thing is about, what piety and impiety are. I mean, essentially, Socrates and Euthyphro, whether Euthyphro knows it or not, are going to have this conversation about what is the proper relationship of human beings to gods. How do we best understand our relationship to the gods? What kinds of service or admiration or praise make sense with them? How do the gods relate to our lives? What impact do they have on our lives? And so this question about piety and impiety is the question about how do we understand the gods and their relation to us? Euthyphro has said that he, more than anyone, has a great grasp, great understanding of this relationship. And so Socrates says, in this very complicated question here on page 6, okay, what is our relationship to the gods? What Socrates is doing is making his initial question so complicated that no one could really answer it very well. Tell me this one form that all acts of piety have in common with other acts of piety that make them acts of piety, and so on. It's very complicated. It's meant to be complicated. Euthyphro answers the question as best as he can. He sort of bumbles, into it. One of the things that Euthyphro says, and it's the important piece for what we're talking about here, one of the things that Euthyphro says, as he talks about the gods, Euthyphro talks about the gods, is that the gods are at war with each other. Euthyphro says on the bottom of page 6, he says, various people believe that Zeus is the best and most just of the gods, yet they agree that he bound his father because he unjustly swallowed his sons, and that he in turn castrated his father for similar reasons. But they are angry with me because I am prosecuting my father for his wrongdoing. They contradict themselves in what they say about the gods and about me. Zeus is saying, look, the gods do these terrible things to people, and their relatives, yet people are angry with me because I'm indicting my father. But look at what the gods do to each other. They treat each other miserably. They castrate each other. They substitute stones for their children. They swallow their children. I mean, the gods are actually pretty cruel and irrational. And Socrates actually calls Euthyphro on this. Socrates says, "Indeed, Euthyphro, this is the reason why I'm a defendant in the case, because I find it hard to accept things like that being said about the gods, and it is likely to be the reason why I shall be told I do wrong. What Socrates says is that he finds it difficult to believe that the gods treat each other this horribly, but Socrates says but Euthyphro says they really do treat each other badly, and Socrates just to make sure that Euthyphro really claims what he's saying, that Euthyphro is not talking in some abstract way. Socrates says to Euthyphro, "And do you believe that there really is war among the gods, and terrible enmities and battles, and other such things as are told by the poets, and so on?" One of the aspects of Socrates that's very important is that when he examined you, he examined you. He did not let you throw out a bunch of different abstract ideas so that you could say, "Oh, well, I was just playing devil's advocate," or I was just testing out this belief, but I don't really believe it myself. I was just kind of throwing it at you. Socrates makes sure when he examines you that he's examining you. And that's why when Socrates talks with people, he always has a part where he says, "And you really believe this?" As he says to Euthyphro here, "And do you really believe that there is war among the gods and terrible enmities and battles?" And Euthyphro immediately cops to that. He immediately says, "Yes, I believe that, and other, amazing things that will amaze people." And so they continue to talk about this, and this is a very important piece, because what Socrates is going to do is he's going to show that Euthyphro does not know what he claims to know. And that means Socrates, using his own method of refutation, is going to show that Euthyphro's beliefs are inconsistent with other beliefs he has. And one of the beliefs that's inconsistent that Euthyphro expresses is that Euthyphro believes that the gods fight each other, that they're at war with each other. Socrates is going to take that belief and show Euthyphro that it's inconsistent with something else that Euthyphro believes. And that other something is on page 8. Euthyphro, as it turns out, does not answer Socrates' original question on page 6 very well. What kind of thing do you say that godliness and ungodliness are, both as regards murder and other things, or is the pious not the same, and the like, and so on? Euthyphro doesn't answer that question very well. So Socrates comes back and rephrases that question. And he says, Socrates on page 8, Socrates rephrases the question. Tell me then, if Socrates says, he says, "Tell me then what this form itself is, so that I may look upon it, and using it as a model, say that any action of yours or another's is of that kind is pious, and if it is not, that it is not. If that is how you want it, Socrates, that is how I will tell you. This is what I want." Euthyphro says, "Well then, what is dear to the gods is pious, what is not dear to the gods is impious." So Socrates essentially says on page 8, "Tell me, Euthyphro, what is piety and impiety?" That's what that stuff about this form itself is, where all acts are pious and impious. It's very complicated. I'm trying to abbreviate it and not doing a very good job. But essentially on page 8, Socrates says to Euthyphro, rephrases the question, what is piety, in a more understandable way, what is piety and impiety? And Socrates and Euthyphro says on page 8, "Well then, what is dear to the gods is pious, what is not is impious." In other words, Socrates is now asking what is piety and impiety, and Euthyphro says piety is what is dear to the gods, and impiety is what is not dear to the gods. Essentially, Euthyphro is saying, you show me an act that is dear to the gods, that the gods love, I'll show you an act that is pious. You show me an act that is hated by the gods or is not dear to the gods, I'll show you an act of impiety. The question is what is pious and impious? What is piety and impiety? What is the proper relationship to the gods? Euthyphro says the what the gods love is what is pious. What the gods hate is impious. Um, and so this is an attempt by Euthyphro to answer the question again. He didn't answer the first question, but in the first question, Euthyphro talked about lots of things. Now, what Socrates is doing, what's important for this, is that Socrates is going to show that the two beliefs of Euthyphro are inconsistent, are contradictory, and he's about to do that on page 8. And Socrates says to Euthyphro on page 8, he's rephrasing Euthyphro's answers. Socrates says, "Come then, let us examine what we mean." Euthyphro essentially says, an action or a man, this is mid-page 8, and Socrates is saying to Euthyphro, you believe that, quote, an action or a man dear to the gods is pious, but an action or a man hated by the gods is impious. They are not the same, but quite opposite, the pious and the impious. Is that not so? So what Socrates is saying is that Euthyphro's second answer is an action or a man dear to the gods is pious, an action or a man hated by the gods is impious. Piety is being loved by the gods, impiety is being hated by the gods. Euthyphro says it is indeed, Socrates, and that seems to be a good statement. Euthyphro, I think so, Socrates. And then Euthyphro, so that's one thing that Euthyphro has said. An action or a man dear to the gods is pious, an action or a man hated by the gods is impious. And then Socrates on page 8 rephrases this other thing that Euthyphro has said on page 6 and 7, that the gods fight each other. So Euthyphro says, so Socrates says, we have also stated that the gods are in a state of discord, that they are at odds with each other, Euthyphro, and that they are at enmity with each other. Has that too been said? Yes. So Socrates is saying you said two things. One is that piety is what is dear to the gods, what is loved by the gods. Impiety is what is not dear to the gods, what is hated by the gods. Show me an act that the gods love, I'll show you an act that is pious. Show me an act that the gods hate, I'll show you an act that is impious. And then Socrates says to Euthyphro, but you've also said, Euthyphro, the gods are in a state of discord, that they are at odds with each other. So Euthyphro, according to Socrates, has also said that the gods are constantly fighting each other. So Socrates is going to show that these two beliefs are inconsistent, that you cannot say both that piety is what is dear to the gods and impiety is what is hated by the gods, and also say that the gods fight each other, that the gods are in a state of discord. Those two statements are inconsistent. Now, if you look at those on page 8, so Socrates is holding those up to each other. Now, it's not clear to Euthyphro, and it may not be clear to you either, why those two beliefs are inconsistent. And Socrates is now about to show Euthyphro why those two beliefs are inconsistent. So Socrates starts by questioning Euthyphro. I mean, remember, Euthyphro has said on page 6 and 7 that the gods disagree with each other. They fight all the time. They do these terrible things. And so Socrates on page 8 and 9 says to Euthyphro, tell me, what is it that human beings disagree about? At the bottom of page 8, Socrates says to Euthyphro, if we differed about the larger and the smaller, we would then turn to measurement and soon cease to differ. What is it that human beings differ? Do we differ about things that are measurable, weighable, countable? And Euthyphro says no. And so one thing that Socrates is establishing, as he establishes on the top of page 9, and about the heavier and the lighter we would resort to weighing and be reconciled. In other words, if you and I disagreed about, how heavy something was, how heavy a book was, we wouldn't get into some big fight about it. We'd weigh the book. You get a scale, you figure it out, you weigh it. It's very exact. We don't have disagreements about that. Human beings don't have disagreements about that. And then Socrates goes on to say, um, he goes on to point out what human beings would get angry at, what we would get angry at. And on page 9, Socrates says to Euthyphro, we don't get angry at things that are countable, but then on page 9, Socrates says, what subject of difference would make us angry and hostile to each other if we were unable to come to a decision? Perhaps, Socrates continues, perhaps you do not have an answer ready, but examine, as I tell you, whether these subjects are the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the bad. Are these not the subjects of difference about which, when we are unable to come to a satisfactory decision, you and I and other men become hostile to each other? In other words, what Socrates is saying here is what human beings disagree about is what is good and bad, right and wrong, beautiful and ugly. That's what we disagree about. We don't disagree about things that are countable. We disagree about right and wrong, about values, basically. Let me put it that way. We disagree about values. And then Socrates, so human beings disagree about values. And then Socrates says to Euthyphro, what about the gods, Euthyphro? If indeed they have differences, will it not be about these same subjects? Meaning, if the gods have differences, they will disagree about right and wrong, good and bad, beautiful and ugly. And Euthyphro says it certainly must be so. And Socrates says, then according to your argument, my good Euthyphro, different gods consider different things to be just, beautiful, ugly, good, and bad. For they would not be at odds with each other unless they differed about those subjects, would they? The gods, like human beings, don't differ about countable things. What the gods differ about is what human beings differ about. What's right and wrong, good and bad, beautiful, ugly, good and bad, and so on. That's what the gods disagree about, as with human beings. And then Socrates says, and they, meaning the gods, and they like what each of them considers beautiful, good, and just, and hate the opposite of these. Euthyphro agrees, certainly. And Socrates says, but you say that the same things are considered just by some gods and unjust by others. And as they dispute about these things, they are at odds and at war with each other. Is that not so? It is. And Socrates says, the same things then are loved by the gods and hated by the gods, and would be both God-loved and God-hated. What Socrates is saying is that since the gods disagree about things, about good and bad and values generally. Since they disagree about things, they disagree about the same things. So some God will love Act A, and another God will hate Act A. I mean, the gods disagree about it. Act A will be good to one God, but Act A will be bad to another god. So the gods disagree about those things because they are values. So Socrates says, let me read that again. It's important. But you say, on page 9, but you say that the same things are considered just by some gods and unjust by others. And as they dispute about these things, they are at odds and at war with each other. When Euthyphro says the gods are at war with each other, what he's saying is that they disagree about the very same things, about the very same actions. And Socrates says, then, again, I'll read it, the same things then are loved by the gods and hated by the gods, and would be both God-loved and God-hated. Euthyphro says, it seems likely. And Socrates says, and the same things would be both pious and impious, according to this argument. What does that mean? I mean, why did Socrates say that? Well, he explains in the last passage on page 9. Socrates says, so you did not answer my question, you surprising man. He insults Euthyphro, which what I think is a really wonderful insult, you surprising person. So you did not answer my question, you surprising man. I did not ask you what same thing is both pious and impious, and it appears that what is loved by the gods is also hated by them. So it is in no way surprising if your present action, namely punishing your father, may be pleasing to Zeus, but displeasing to Cronus and Uranus, pleasing to Hephaestus, but displeasing to Hera, and so with any other gods who differ from each other on this subject. What Socrates is saying that um, is that once Euthyphro says that the gods are at war with each other, that then indicates that they disagree about values. One god loves Act A, and another god hates Act A. Well, what Euthyphro has said also is that piety is what the gods love, and impiety is what the gods hate. The problem is, since the gods disagree, one god loves Act A, and therefore Act A will be pious to that god, and another god hates Act A, and therefore, according to Euthyphro's definition, that Act A will be impious to the other god. So, when the gods love and hate the same acts, and piety is what the gods love, and impiety is what the gods hate, the same Act A will be loved by one god and therefore pious to that god, but Act A will be hated by another god and therefore impious to that god. So what Socrates is pointing out is that according to Euthyphro's definition and his answer that the gods are at war with each other, and what is dear to the gods is pious, what is not is impious. According to Euthyphro's definition, the same act will be both pious and impious, which is impossible. The same thing cannot be this way and its opposite in the same sense. So when Euthyphro says what is pious, what is dear to the gods is pious, and what is hated by the gods is impious, but that the gods also disagree with each other, the implication of that is that the gods love and hate the very same objects, the very same acts. So what Socrates is pointing out is that Euthyphro's statements contradict each other. They are inconsistent. You can't say both that the gods are at war and disagree with each other, and that what is dear to the gods is pious and what is not dear to the gods is impious. I know this is very complicated, and I know it's very detailed, and I apologize for that. The point here is that I want you to see Socrates' method. What Socrates is doing is he is trying to show, he's trying to examine Euthyphro, and in this examination, Socrates is looking to see if Euthyphro's beliefs are consistent, or rather, if they are contradictory with other beliefs that Euthyphro has. In this first go-around in the Euthyphro, it becomes clear that Euthyphro's first attempts to define what is piety, they're confused. It doesn't make sense. And one of the general points that Socrates makes is that you cannot act morally if your beliefs are inconsistent. Socrates' examinations are moral examinations. Socrates' idea is that since our actions follow from our beliefs and our principles, if your beliefs and principles are confused and inconsistent and contradictory, you can't possibly be acting morally in the right way. I mean, how can you do the right thing if your beliefs are all messed up? They're all contradictory. And so what he's showing here specifically to Euthyphro is that Euthyphro's, and this is what he does throughout the Euthyphro, and this is all we're going to look at with Euthyphro, but what he's showing to Euthyphro ultimately is that Euthyphro, you can't be doing the right thing by charging your father with murder. Because you don't, with impiety because of murder, because you don't understand what piety and impiety are. How do I know, Socrates is saying, how do I know that you don't understand what piety and impiety are? Because those beliefs are inconsistent and contradictory to other beliefs you have. You can't be acting morally if your beliefs are inconsistent. Now, in the larger scheme of the Euthyphro, what Socrates is really doing here is, in his examination of Euthyphro, is he is examining Euthyphro to show Euthyphro that Euthyphro, thinks he has knowledge but doesn't. And so, in the Euthyphro, neither Euthyphro nor Socrates know what piety is. I mean, one of the curious things about the Euthyphro is that even though they discuss 5 or 6 definitions or attempts to answer what piety and impiety are, they never answer it. Socrates doesn't answer it either. All they find out, really, is what piety and impiety are not. But they don't come to some conclusion what piety and impiety are. Now, at the beginning of the Euthyphro, Euthyphro thinks he knows what piety is, even though, as Socrates shows in the Euthyphro, he doesn't know what piety is. So at the beginning of the Euthyphro, neither Euthyphro nor Socrates know what piety and impiety are. But Euthyphro, at the beginning of the dialogue, Euthyphro thinks he knows what piety is, whereas Socrates knows that he doesn't know. So this very interesting situation begins at the beginning of Euthyphro. Let me say that again. Euthyphro, at the beginning of the dialogue, thinks he knows what piety is, but doesn't. Socrates, at the beginning of the dialogue, doesn't know what piety is, but knows that he doesn't know what piety is. By the end of the dialogue, and going through 5 or 6 definitions, and each time Socrates shows Euthyphro that he does not, in fact, have consistent beliefs, by the end of the dialogue, they still don't know what piety is. But here's the difference. At the beginning of the dialogue, Euthyphro thinks he knows what piety is, but doesn't. At the end of the dialogue, Euthyphro now knows that he doesn't know what piety is. Socrates doesn't know what piety is either at the end of the dialogue, but he didn't. But he knew that he didn't know at the beginning. So so in the whole dialogue, and I know this is repetitive, it will probably be annoying to you, but again, in the dialogue, at the beginning of the dialogue, neither Socrates nor Euthyphro know what piety is, but Euthyphro thinks he knows what piety is. At the end of the dialogue, Euthyphro still doesn't know what piety is, but now he knows that he doesn't know what piety is. What's interesting here is, one of the interesting things here is that Socrates' method of refutation is so clear that even Euthyphro has to recognize that he didn't know what piety is. You know, in many of our conversations in real life, we sort of blather on about our beliefs. We don't really know what's going on. We talk with other people. We disagree with them. When we disagree with them, it's not clear to us who wins an argument. Most of us, in our disagreements that we have with other people, we probably go away from the arguments believing the same darn things that we did at the beginning. But with Socrates, it was different, because he showed you that you didn't know what you thought you knew, and he does it in a certain sense, in a very straightforward way. He showed you that you didn't know what you claimed to know, because he showed you again and again and again that your beliefs kept contradicting other beliefs of yours. And you can be sure that someone doesn't know something if their beliefs are contradictory to other beliefs that they have. So, at the beginning of the Euthyphro thinks he knows what piety is and impiety is, but he doesn't. At the end of the dialogue, Socrates has shown him in absolute certainty that Euthyphro doesn't know what piety and impiety are. And he shows him certainly that, because his beliefs are contradictory. And so the end of the dialogue is very interesting. On page 20, and they go around about these discussions again and again. I mean, it comes up and it comes back. At the end, Socrates has refuted 5 or 6 definitions. On page 20, and I'm going to read the whole thing. Page 20, they've just finished their 6th attempt to define what piety and impiety are, and they failed at it. How do they know they failed? Because it contradicts all sorts of other things that Euthyphro believes. So Socrates says on page 20, after concluding another argument that where there is contradiction, Socrates says, either we were wrong when we agreed before, or if we were right then, we are wrong now. And Euthyphro says, that seems to be so. And Socrates says, so we must investigate again from the beginning what piety is. I shall not willingly give up before I learn this. So they don't know what piety and impiety are. Socrates is not giving up. And Socrates says, do not think me unworthy, but concentrate your attention and tell the truth. For you know it, if any man does, and I must not let you go like Proteus before you tell me. And then Socrates just totally digs into Euthyphro. You should keep in mind, by the way, whenever Socrates spoke with someone in public, which is when people spoke to each other, it was all public, Socrates gathered a crowd. So it is likely that in this conversation about piety and impiety, that there's been a crowd of people that have gathered around on the courthouse. And Socrates was a major attraction. Where he went, other people were sure to go. So what Socrates is about to do is he is about to publicly shame and humiliate Euthyphro by being so sarcastic. He says to Euthyphro, if you had no clear knowledge of piety and impiety, you would never have ventured to prosecute your old father for murder on behalf of a servant. For fear of the gods, you would have been afraid to take the risk, lest you should not be acting rightly, and would have been ashamed before men. And now I know well that you believe that you have clear knowledge of piety and impiety. So tell me, my good Euthyphro, and do not hide what you think it is. It is so clear to Euthyphro also that he doesn't have a clue what piety and impiety are, and yet Socrates says to Euthyphro, I'm sorry, it's quite comical in a sort of cruel, mean way. Socrates says, you would never have indicted your father for murder. You would have been ashamed before human beings if you had indicted your father for murder without knowing what piety and impiety are. So surely you know it. But it's exactly what Euthyphro has done. He has indicted his father without knowing what piety and impiety are. And so Socrates is saying, not if you had indicted your father, you should be ashamed before human beings. He's saying you have done this. If you had no clear knowledge of piety and impiety, you would never have ventured to prosecute your old father for murder on behalf of a servant. For fear of the gods, you would have been afraid to take the risk, lest you should not be acting rightly, and would have been ashamed before men. But now I know well that you believe you have clear knowledge of piety and impiety. Socrates is saying you should be ashamed before men and the gods for doing what you're doing without having clear knowledge about it. How do we know that you have no clear knowledge? Because you have consistently contradicted yourself. You have raised one definition, one attempt to explain what it is after another that is false, inconsistent, and contradictory. And yet you have engaged in this act of trying to prosecute your father without knowledge of what it is you are prosecuting him for. And Socrates continues to pump Euthyphro up. I mean, this is all so sarcastic. And Euthyphro, and Socrates says, so tell me, my good Euthyphro, and do not hide what you think it is. Euthyphro is totally humiliated at this point. You must understand that. And Euthyphro says to Socrates, some other time, Socrates, for I am in a hurry now, and it is time for me to go. And Socrates says, what a thing to do, my friend. By going you have cast me down from a great hope I had, that I would learn from you the nature of the pious and the impious, and so escape Meletus's indictment by showing him that I had acquired wisdom in divine matters from Euthyphro, and my ignorance would no longer cause me to be careless and inventive about such things, and that I would be better for the rest of my life. The interpretation of this last part is that Euthyphro is so humiliated. You remember at the beginning of the Euthyphro, of the dialogue, he's going into the courthouse to prosecute to indict his father for murder, the punishment for which is death. And so he's going in there. That's when he meets Socrates. The interpretation of this end here is that Euthyphro is so ashamed before the gods and men that he no longer goes into the courthouse to prosecute his father. That the interpretation here is that Euthyphro storms away, humiliated and angry. Some other time, Socrates, for I am in a hurry now, and it is time for me to go. What Socrates has done here is he has prevented Euthyphro from committing a great crime. Prosecuting his father, wrongly prosecuting his father for a crime that he, Euthyphro, did not understand. And so when we think about Socrates' method of examination, his method of refutation, pointing out contradictions and inconsistencies, the goal of that is not just for the pleasure of humiliating someone, an arrogant, conceited person like Euthyphro. The goal is not just for that kind of pleasure, even though it probably is pleasurable at some level. The goal is to prevent Euthyphro and to prevent people from committing moral crimes and political crimes for that matter. And let me say a word about this here. There is a certain pleasure to what Socrates has done. Why is this? Is it fun to humiliate people? Not everybody, but it's not lacking in pleasure to humiliate people who are so full of themselves that they that they put themselves in positions of doing great crimes. I mean, let me draw your attention back to page 5 when when Socrates and Euthyphro have this exchange. Whereas by Zeus, Euthyphro, you think that your knowledge of the divine and of piety and impiety is so accurate that when those things happened, as you say, you have no fear of having acted impiously and bringing your father into trial. And Euthyphro says, I should be of no use, Socrates, and Euthyphro would not be superior to the majority of men if I did not have accurate knowledge of all such things. Danger comes from people who are so full of themselves and so arrogant that they commit horrible crimes. And what Socrates is doing is not just for pleasure. He is doing it to show people their crimes and to prevent them from committing great wrongs. But it is pleasurable because, at some level, because some people are so full of themselves that the way you puncture them, the way you get them, that you prevent them from doing crimes, and I'm sorry to put it this way, at some level is to laugh at them, is to humiliate them before the gods and men. And that is what Socrates has done to Euthyphro. So I want you to be clear in this, that Socrates is not just toying with someone for the sport of it. It is not just humiliating Euthyphro for pure pleasure. The humiliation has a point, and unfortunately, it may take humiliation. It may take puncturing someone's self-conceit to stop them from doing something wrong. I mean, that's the question. How do you deal with someone who is so certain of their own knowledge? How do you deal with people who are so arrogant? How do you get to them? Well, Socrates says, you humiliate them before the gods and men, and you do that by pointing out to them the inconsistencies and contradictions in their claims. And that is what Socrates has done to Euthyphro. So there is a moral point to this examination. We must examine ourselves and others. Euthyphro may be humiliated. That's clear. It's clear that he is. But if Euthyphro really gets the full lesson, he'll not only not prosecute his father, he'll try to understand then what piety and impiety are. As Socrates says, the beginning of wisdom, the origin of knowledge, is admitting or confessing your ignorance. Euthyphro is in a state now, in a position now, where he has to admit his ignorance. Now, if he makes the choice, now he can get knowledge and wisdom about piety and impiety. He couldn't get it before Socrates humiliated him and showed him that his beliefs were inconsistent and contradiction. But now we can. So the unexamined life is not a worthwhile life for human beings. Euthyphro's life can now be worthwhile because he can now seek out real wisdom by starting with the idea that he is ignorant and now starting his investigations in ignorance. Thank you. Have a nice day.